Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you all for being here for what turns out to be our now sort of annual celebration of Thomas Hart Benton. We're at about the I think something like 123rd in a day or two birthday of Thomas Hart Benton. We should really be doing this at Kelly's next year. Next year we will do it at Kelly's. So tonight we are going to do our annual celebration of our greatest painter, Thomas Hart Benton. You know, he's the greatest Kansas City painter, vies with George Caleb Bing to be the greatest Missouri painter, greatest Midwestern painter. Time magazine is the first artist ever to go on the cover of Time magazine. There was a moment at which he might be thought to be America's greatest artist. That changed over time. That wouldn't be true necessarily today. But Justin Wolff has written a great biography of him that takes him from the House of Lords, that's the saloon in Joplin, where he may have sold his first artwork, to the Café de Dôme in Paris, and then back. These things always come in a circle back to Kelly's in Kansas City. And there is a flow in Benton's life which Justin Wolff captures, which is much like the flow, the dynamism, the undulations of his very best paintings, the great murals, which we have examples of here and around the world. It's an incredible career, as Justin Wolff outlines it, where he goes from being on the cover of Time magazine to being fired by the Art Institute. But the essence of Thomas Hart Benton is really captured in the idea stressed by Justin Wolff in this wonderful book, that Thomas Hart Benton really was like his great uncle, the Senator Thomas Hart Benton, a Jeffersonian at heart, with all that implies, a kind of aristocratic populist. I did learn one thing from this book that I didn't know before, and I've read a lot about Thomas Hart Benton and UMB, which I used to be the CEO of. We have the Benton estate, and so I've been concerned with Benton in many ways, in New Jersey and TP and members of the family. But I learned one thing that I didn't know before from this book. There's a great piece which caught my eye because he died recently. A great quote from Mike Wallace that Justin has in the book about seeing Tom Benton towards the end of his life on Martha's Vineyard. They lived near each other on Martha's Vineyard, and he was going to be speaking to a group, and he obviously was not happy about that, and so Mike Wallace thought he would do something for him. So he did the one thing for him that he knew would really cheer him up. He mixed him a batch of ice cold martinis. I didn't realize he was a martini drinker, so there's also a quote in the book from John Cannaday, who was not a big fan of Benton's work, who's an art critic for the Times and others, and prolific writer on art, and where he talks about the bastard combination in Benton's work of Huck Finn and El Greco. And I love that quote. I love that quote, and I think it's exactly right, except it's part of the greatness of Thomas Hart Benton. Justin says in the book that at the end of the book that it's very hard to pin Tom Benton down because of these seeming contradictions. Except it seems to me it's that Jeffersonian Mark Twain, Huck Finn. Sometimes you're rolling down the river, and sometimes you just want to lay back and lie on the banks of the river, like Huck Finn and like some of his greatest paintings. It's that those contradictions ultimately make up the great story of our great painter. And Justin Wolff, who is a professor at the University of Maine, tells a great story in this book. Justin.
Thank you all for coming out. This is a great crowd. Very excited about that. Thanks for the nice introduction, Crosby. Now, you can't give an art historian a podium and a PowerPoint and not expect a lecture. So my plan this evening is to lecture for about 35 minutes. I won't be reading from the book. I'll be talking about something else. And Then I will be more than happy to take questions about anything, about things that I've talked about this evening, things about the book, about the writing of the book, or about aspects of Benton's art or life that I haven't touched on. So I'd like to begin my talk this evening by taking a minute to thank the Kansas City Public Library for inviting me to speak with you today about Thomas Hart Benton. I have fond memories of visiting this library when I was researching the book, and needless to say, it has the world's most extensive collection of books, films, and manuscripts by and about Benton. And the library fulfills its mission by making these easily accessible to anyone who's interested. And as we're in the middle of National Library Week, I did my research on that one, it's worth at least a minute to be grateful for such wonderfully democratic public institutions as libraries. These are indeed sacred places, and like our state universities, they need your support now more than ever. So, in honor of National Library Week, I will be focusing my talk today on Thomas Hart Benton's literary accomplishments, in particular his 1937 memoir, An Artist in America. And you see the cover of the first edition of the memoir on the right there. But first, some background on Benton, a refresher for many of you, I am sure. Benton is often described as the most controversial artist America has ever seen. He has always been a tempting subject for writers, as he was significantly larger than life. The dynamic figures in his paintings and murals reflect his own unflagging industriousness. He worked fast, taught himself harmonica, drove all over the country, got in fistfights, and rafted whitewater rapids. And these assiduous figures also distracted average folk and cultural critics alike from many of their Depression-era anxieties. The Great Depression showed Americans that their nation had grown too conceptual, based as it was on an inscrutable economy. I think we are very familiar with the inscrutability of our economy in this day and age. But Benton reoriented the nation to Jefferson's image of pragmatic agrarianism. He was a ravenous reader, devouring, for instance, books by Jefferson, Frederick Jackson Turner, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, and John Dewey, all of whom taught him about the heroic figures we know as the American individual. By the mid-1930s, many citizens had lost faith in the American legends of long ago. What Benton was able to do better than any artist of his generation was reacquaint many of the skeptics with this folklore. And this had an uplifting, salubrious effect on the American consciousness at a moment of profound despair. But therein lay the controversy as well. For Benton's form of uplift was, to many of his close friends on the radical left, little more than sentimental kitsch. The crisis of the Depression demanded avant-garde political action, not folksy nostalgia. And Benton got caught smack in the middle of this political feud. And you can see in this comparison, for instance, the difference between Benton's hard-playing frontiersman and Rockwell Kent's radical Union man, shovel in hand, fighting off the Union busters. But Benton certainly didn't try very hard to avoid controversy. His poor judgment, his heavy drinking and profanity, his belligerent baiting of any artist walking a different stylistic or ideological path scandalized New Yorkers, New Englanders, and Missourians alike. And over the years, he disparaged abstract painters, women, curators, intellectuals, and many of his old friends, several of whom, such as Alfred Stieglitz, Jackson Pollock, and Lewis Mumford, happened to be very influential cultural figures. The art historian Henry Adams has said that Benton, quote, tilted as many windmills as Don Quixote. Now, despite his plain Midwestern fashion, his denim, gingham, and flannel, Benton was neither simple nor modest. And he didn't mellow with age. In 1969, just 6 years before he died, and long after he'd retreated to the rural comforts of Chilmark, a quaint village on Martha's Vineyard, a reporter for Life magazine observed that at 80, Thomas Hart Benton was, quote, still at war with bores and boobs. Now here is the arc of Benton's life in brief. He was born in 1889 in Neosho, Missouri. He started making pictures as a boy, which put him at odds with his father, a lawyer, and then a Democratic U.S. congressman. Against their better judgment, his parents sent him to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he showed great promise. On the recommendation of his teachers, he went to study art in Paris in 1908. After 4 years in Europe, during which he chafed against formal instruction and tried his hand at academic painting, impressionism, pointillism, fauvism, and cubism, he moved to New York City. And in New York, briefly under the spell of modernists like Alfred Stieglitz and Stanton McDonald Wright, Benton, as he put it, quote, wallowed in every cockeyed ism that came along. In Bubbles, for instance, we see an example of his experimentation with synchromism, an abstract style developed by Morgan Russell and his close friend, McDonald Wright, that, in theory anyway, pictorialized synchronous musical harmonies. However we may judge today the coherency of synchronism's aesthetic principles, it was Bubbles, in fact, that earned Benton his first major success, a place in New York's 1916 Forum exhibition of modern American painters. This much is undeniable. It's in the telling of how Benton got, in about 10 years' time, from Bubbles to the realism that we see in Boomtown, that legend has superseded history. The legend has stuck for two principal reasons. First, because it's a story that Benton himself told in terse, honest-sounding prose in his remarkable memoir, An Artist in America, published in 1937. And second, because it's an archetypal story. Benton's account of his transformation from a modernist to a realist begins with his dying father. In March 1924, Benton says he left New York and moved with his father, who was dying a slow death from cancer, to a hospice in Springfield, Missouri. For a month and a half, he sat at his dad's bedside, watching him waste away and listening to fevered reminiscences of his political campaigns. In a letter to his mother, Benton described his father as, quote, pitiful. One memory in the letter, he relates, quote, he was sleeping the other afternoon, and as I watched him, his jaws and hands were continually moving as if intent on something. I watched him a long time. When he awoke, he said he had dreamed he was cutting and eating a big steak with mashed potatoes. It was all I could do to keep the tears back. Now, Benton claimed to be transformed by his father's death, which coincided with the Missouri Democratic Convention, and dozens of delegates, including boss Tom Pendergast, the corrupt political leader, visited their old representative in the hospital to shake his hand one last time. I listened to old-timers try to revive my father's failing interest in things, Benton recalls, and I got a renewed sense of the variety and picturesqueness of his life and of the life of the people of my home country, which the infatuated artistic vanities of the city had brought me to regard as stale and stuffy. The art historian Matthew Bagel imagines a poignant experience full of Freudian symbolism. In the conflict between his father's earlier rejection of his art and Benton's desire for retroactive acceptance, Bagel writes, Benton began to identify very closely with his father. Now, Benton claims in his memoir that observing his father connect with his constituents one last time compelled him to return to the region, the Springfield Plateau and the Ozark Mountains, that he hadn't visited since his father's campaigns during the turn of the century. So rather than returning right away to New York after his father's death, Benton stayed in the area for several months, traveling dirt roads and making drawings of farmers, fiddle players, and backwoods folk. Of these people, he writes, quote, the flavor of a pre-machine age past hangs in their drawling speech, along with a certain contempt for the regulatory claims of governing bodies, a heritage from our pioneer fathers. Now, his mountain mother illustrates the point. She's a woman shaped by her hard-won experiences in the Ozarks, the bumps and hollows, Benton's term for convex and concave volumes, or at least the illusion of convex and concave volumes. The bumps and hollows of her dimensional face even resemble the terrain that has made her. So as Benton writes it, after years of artistic experimentation in Chicago, Paris, and New York, he returned to Missouri to lay claim to the folksy populism that was his birthright. The prodigal son returned home to finally accept his patrimony. A moving story, to be sure. but a false one. And the proof is in the art. For the earthy agrarian style of Mountain Mother, the drawing that we just saw, was already on display in paintings like Self-Portrait with Rita, his wife, and The Yankee Driver, which he made on Martha's Vineyard in 1922 and 1923, a full 2 years before he returned to Missouri to attend to his dying father. During their third summer on Martha's Vineyard in 1922, Benton painted Self-Portrait with Rita, which shows the couple on a beach near the Gay Head Cliffs on the southwestern tip of the vineyard. At the time, he was abandoning abstract painting for a realist style influenced by Renaissance, Mannerist, and Baroque artists. In fact, Self-Portrait with Rita was a debut of sorts, a calculated presentation of his newfound aesthetic, which he fashioned from the influence of the muscular figures that we see in the works of Michelangelo and Peter Paul Rubens. Benton continued working in this style with a few modifications for the rest of his long career. His easel paintings and murals depict similarly robust figures situated in stylized landscapes, cityscapes, and interiors. The painting introduces what would become Benton's trademark dynamism. It is distinguished by undulating forms, as in the globular clouds, and complementary convexities and concavities, again what Benton called bumps and hollows, evident in the deep contours of his chiseled chest. The push and pull of the forms continues across the entire composition, which is animated by contrast between light and dark, between recessive and dominant space. There's a stirring organic quality to their figures as well, as if Tom and Rita have absorbed into their bodies the vitality of nature itself. Benton represents himself as a modern Poseidon, modeled by and just risen from the ocean glimpsed to his right. Rita, who sits in front of him, recalls the Madonnas in Mannerist paintings. Her strong, elongated figure appears to have been cut by the same ocean forces that pound at the Gay Head Cliffs seen behind them. Benton was sure he'd found his style, and the painting was his proclamation to the art world that it had better pay attention. Now, the Yankee Driver, in the later painting, is in fact one Billy Benson, an infamous character in Chilmark, who was, quote, a handyman who did odd jobs around the property where Benton stayed and was known for stealing sheep and once, which is key, trying to poison his parents with arsenic. Unsuccessful. Benton appears to have decontextualized the Yankee Driver. He shows only a glimpse of land behind him. But upon closer inspection, we notice that the driver's environment is there, in the bumps and hollows of his flesh. Benton, in fact, borrowed these terms, bump and hollow, from the idioms of topographic description, the undulating copses and so-called hollers of hilly terrain. As Benton pictures him, the Yankee Driver's face has absorbed his environment. He has lived his locale into his body, which is bent and crooked and heaves like the hills around Chilmark. Looking at the Yankee Driver, we know what Lewis Mumford meant when reviewing a Benton exhibition in New York the next year. He exclaimed, quote, he draws people out of their soil, like potatoes with the earth still clinging to them. This chronological inconsistency reveals the complex ideological work that his memoir attempts. An Artist in America, in fact, is full of myth. The book is part of Benton's effort to portray himself as a Midwestern bumpkin, as a bona fide member of the regionalist school of art that blossomed in Kansas, Wisconsin, and Missouri. That Benton's version of his artistic development was accepted as truth by so many speaks to the persuasiveness of the book's honest-to-goodness prose. Benton was much more than a popular painter of popular themes. He was also a superb writer who authored 2 memoirs, articles on the practice of art and the political and philosophical ideologies of the modern era, reviews of the work of his peers, and numerous articles on his life in Paris, New York, and Missouri. In a 1989 documentary film about Benton, produced by Ken Burns, the just-deceased art critic Hilton Kramer says, quote, I think that Benton really missed his vocation. He should have been a writer rather than a painter. Now, Kramer disliked Benton's paintings, which he deemed, quote, pure kitsch, but praised his prose. I think his autobiography is really a splendidly written memoir, Kramer explains. And what I particularly admire about it are these very short, tough sentences. I mean, every sentence is really like a kind of bullseye. End quote. An Artist in America is regularly lauded as the best memoir by an American artist. It is a flinty, pungent recollection of his boyhood in Missouri, his struggles as a modernist painter in New York, his turn to American scene painting in the 1920s, and the heady political debates of the 1930s and 1940s. The bulk of the book recounts his many journeys into the American hinterland, his solitary sojourns in the Ozarks, his trips to the Rockies and Hollywood, and his whitewater rafting trips on America's greatest waterways. Along the way, Benton pauses to philosophize about the development of American art and to reflect on the emergence of a new abstract strains in painting. And he pulls no punches. And though he works hard to portray himself as a peasant, the book also demonstrates the degree to which Benton had become a refined intellectual with a keen understanding of John Dewey's pragmatist philosophy and Lewis Mumford's theories about regionalism. Now, Benton published An Artist in America, again, as I said, in 1937, 2 years after he'd left New York and returned to Missouri. The last chapter of the first edition is titled, in fact, Back to Missouri. And here he explains what prompted him to leave New York City after over 20 years there. Quote, seeing the country's ferment and prospects of immense changes in its allegiances, I had the desire to escape the narrow intellectualism of New York. I had the desire to escape the narrow intellectualism of the New York people with whom I associated and to get more closely acquainted with the actual temper of the common people of America. I had no way of doing this in any permanent manner and at the same time be sure of making a living, but I considered the matter extensively. I lived much with those who, under the illusory sway of their own logical structures, ventured to predict our American future. And I didn't believe them. I didn't believe they knew what they were talking about. I had myself no certitudes about our future. I could foresee nothing. I was aware, however, of the changes coming over the political psychology of our country, and I hankered to be close to the soil on which these would be most clearly operative. He continues, the great cities are outworn. Humane living is no longer possible within them. New York, he says, is provincial, and its intellectuals dogmatic, self-righteous, and humorless. Now, subsequent editions of the autobiography were published in 1951 and 1968, each with an additional chapter. But Benton never revised his original conception of himself as, quote, an artist in America. At the end of the book, in fact, he proclaims that he will neither retract his words nor ever return to the East Coast. He never did retract his words, though, of course, he spent every summer on Martha's Vineyard. For the most part, then, the self whom he created in the book, aggrandized through its association with the mythic American male, stood firm for nearly 40 years. As many have noted, the very act of writing an autobiography appears characteristically American as well. Though a mode of expression dating back to Augustine, Americans by the thousands, since the middle of the 17th century, have found the autobiography to be, in the words of William Dean Howells, the most democratic province in the Republic of Letters. Compatible with the democratic principles of freedom and equality, it allows any individual, rich or poor, notorious or anonymous, to have a voice. As the cultural historian Thomas Dougherty puts it, autobiography seems to be a form peculiarly suited to the traditional American self-image, individualistic and optimistic. So the act of writing the book, and not just its survey of Depression-era Americana, must be seen as a crucial part of Benton's self-fashioning as the most American artist. However, as Anais Nin testifies in her autobiographical reflections, individual identity is never inevitable. It is instead achieved, and its achievement often involves distortion through omission and emphasis. The self Benton achieves in An Artist in America is implicit in the dedication of the book to his son, T.P., short for Thomas Piacenza. Born in 1926, TP was 9 when the Bentons moved back to Missouri, and 11 when his father wrote his autobiography, which begins with an account of his own rough and tumble boyhood in the little town of Neosho. As if seeking to recreate the past specifically for his son, Benton opens the autobiography with this sentence, quote, "My early childhood was passed in a country radically different in atmosphere and flavor from that known to boys today." In his depiction of his childhood in turn-of-the-century small-town Missouri, Benton not only suspends the passage of time through the evocation of an idealized past, but also sets his own boyhood as a model for his son. Huck Finn, the all-American boy, whose image Benton had just finished painting as part of the murals for the Missouri State Capitol, appears as the model for this boyhood. Like Huck, Benton, first boy and later man, quote, and this is Benton, had certain reservations about gentility and honorable company. As the autobiography's language makes apparent, Benton, also like Huck, developed a facility for bombastic self-expression. "I was argumentative enough," he claims, "but I could not be induced to study, and I had a low taste for bank company." That TP told his mother, Rita, "I don't want to be a gentleman when I grow up. I want to be like my dad." Clearly pleased, Benton. But An Artist in America suggests that Benton had another audience in mind, besides his son. He explains that the book was written, quote, "for people in general, and by an artist who had come to feel that the engagement of their interests had top priority." Benton's desire to write for people in general, as he puts it, expresses an essentially egalitarian intention. His desire to engage their interests and understanding suggests an eagerness neither to educate nor elevate, but rather to stimulate and to appease. His priorities here imply an appreciation for the folk, his concern for their approval and their acceptance. He comes to see himself as shaped by these people and as sharing their values. He writes for these people. He writes about these people, these hard-playing, hard-working, good-natured, and good-humored folk. He embraces them, and if he's to be believed, they embrace him in return. Again, though, it's not just that the book takes us into the American hinterland that allows it to do the ideological work of representing Benton as one of them, or one of us. The language, too, comes across as folksy. The short, direct sentences and no-nonsense vocabulary suggest that here is a man who won't humor fools. Listen, for instance, to his description of backwoods holy rollers. The peculiar brand of, and this is a fairly long quote now, the peculiar brand of ecstatic religion, popularly known as the holy roller faith, which has been sweeping the South for the last 15 years, and which is such a wild mixture of sex, exhibitionism, and hysteria, had its origin in that home of extravagant idiocy, Los Angeles, California. The first complete example of their God's work was shown to me in a deep mountain gully under the dark, spotted shade of a high and thick timber. A great gathering was there. Around the sides of the gully on outjutting edges of rock sat the half-convinced and the utterly skeptical. Down in its center were gathered the faithful, around a rough stand of planks. My preacher and his guitar-strumming brethren got on the stand and bowed their heads in silent prayer. Out of the utter quiet of wordless worship, broken by no whisper, accentuated by the dark, motionless canopy of the green above, they rose suddenly, smiting their strings and bringing their feet down and their voices up in one mighty burst of roaring sound. Their hymn, a fast 2/4, evidently very familiar, was taken up by the crowd with almost the precision of trained performers. The whole outfit sang and clapped their hands in a swiftly mounting crescendo. When the rhythmical din was at its height, a young girl in a simple white dress and a little cheap but stylish hat moved slowly into the clear space before the stand. Her eyelids were half closed. Her shoulders and hips began to move. 2 men stepped into the opening. They shouted, "Amen, blessed be his name," and they took to dancing about the girl. End quote. Now, the content here speaks to the folk traditions he believed to offer a vital antithesis to the modernity of New York City. But it's the language, the short but vivid sentences, the punchy nouns and verbs, that carries the meaning. His descriptive anecdotal prose embodies the very opposite of the airy obscurity he identified in a more experimental and modern art forms. Benton was also a poignant naturalist. In the memoir, he writes about mountains, the ocean, and his favorite subject, perhaps, America's great rivers. He maintains that it's on these rivers, and not in American cities, that one can make of himself whatever he wishes. Down the river is freedom from consequence, he writes. All one has to do is jump in a skiff at night, and by the morrow be beyond reach of trouble. In the past, fellows who had been too handy with a knife or gun could float off into a new world and begin again. The river waters are suggestive of release. The thought of floating effortlessly away on running water has an irresistible charm. In Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain has caught the spirit of this, and back of the adventures of Huck and Jim, there is always the moving river and the promises and hopes that lie around its unfolding bends. Sensing, perhaps, that his tone has grown too philosophical, Benton makes sure to bring his ruminating mind back down to earth. Recalling a river trip on a tugboat that brought him to Memphis, he writes, quote, "At Memphis, I bought a big plug of chewing tobacco and took up again one of my old ways of settling down after a debauch of food. I'd put a comfortable chair on deck in the shade of the pilot house and sit for an hour or so, sensually rolling the pungent juice of the tobacco around my jaws. I'd spit it far out into the Yellow River." Benton also discusses how his interaction with these American types influenced his art. During the making of my Missouri mural in 1936, he writes, "I traveled all over the state. I met all kinds of people. I played the harmonica and wore a pink shirt to country dances." Hard to imagine that one. "I went on hunting and fishing parties. I attended an uproarious 3-day-old settlers drunk in the depth of the Ozarks. I went to political barbecues and church picnics. I took in the honky-tonks of the country and nightclubs of Kansas City and St. Louis. I went to businessmen's parties and to meetings of art lovers' associations. I went down in the mines and out in the cornfields. I chased Missouri society up and down from the shacks of the Ozark hillbillies to the country club firesides of the ultimately respectable." He also expresses his confidence that he captured these people accurately. "I think most real Missourians are beginning to like me," he writes. Now remember, he's writing in 1937, and he just arrived back in Missouri in 1936. So "I think most real Missourians are beginning to like me," he writes, "and have come to the conclusion that I intended and made a pretty fair picture of my state. I should have done better had I painted a sweeter picture of Missouri, something a little more delicate, a little more violet-scented. This seems to me a bit odd because in my whole experience of Missouri Democrats, I've never run across any little woodland flowers. And I don't believe I've ever seen a single Democrat politician, drunk or sober, who wouldn't bust you if he thought you mistook him for a violet." But the book also contains many clues to the biggest secret that Benton kept from his readers, which is that he was a sophisticated, educated, and well-read intellectual, not a country rube. Now, this he accomplished by absorbing the dense philosophical and sociological arguments made by such leading 30s intellectuals as William Carlos Williams, Lewis Mumford, and John Dewey. He doesn't mention any of these names in An Artist in America, but the influence of all three is evident everywhere. And so herein lies part of his deception. Even as he was striking a plain-speaking tone in his accounts of American folk customs, he was drawing from esoteric discourses about regionalism and the nature of experience. Just when Benton was beginning to make his regionalist paintings on Martha's Vineyard, Van Wyck Brooks and other usable past critics were arguing for the value of those 19th century writers who'd emphasized how the American land had shaped American character, how place determines experience. Now, one literary figure who Benton certainly knew of, though they weren't friends, was William Carlos Williams. It wasn't Williams' poems so much as the content of the magazine Contact, which Williams co-edited, that caught Benton's attention. Contact was Williams' word for the coming together of place and language. And in the inaugural issue of the Handmade magazine, he states that it was, quote, issued in the conviction that art which attains is indigenous of experience and relations. Williams' argument would have appealed to Benton because Williams urged American artists to temper their enthusiasm for European aesthetics, writing, quote, if Americans are to be blessed with important work, it will be through intelligent, informed contact with the locality, which alone can infuse it with reality. We are here, Williams adds, because of our faith in the existence of native artists who are capable of having, comprehending, and recording ordinary experiences. Artists who deal with our situations. So the notion of contact for William Carlos Williams was a way of moving beyond Ralph Waldo Emerson's self-reliance and arguing instead for an interdependent individualism and social awareness. Williams and some attempted to humanize knowledge by stressing the fact that to be truly useful to us, knowledge must be seen as having a body, an immediate concreteness which we apprehend immediately before we usefully assimilate it intellectually. Williams was a paradox, an avant-garde poet who held the position that modernism dislocated one from time and space. His sense of locality begins with an awareness of physiological presence in time and space. Another major influence on Benton's regionalist aesthetics was Lewis Mumford, one of the first critics to champion his art. Mumford would argue that, quote, the human region existed as a fact long before the political state as we know it came into existence, and that the region provides a common background. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the landscape we see, the accumulation of experience and custom peculiar to the setting tend to unify its inhabitants. And Mumford advised, quote, avoid sweeping national crusades for change and start immediately in your own region and locale to lay the basis for the renewal of life. More than most, however, Mumford emphasized the role of the creative artist in the process of social transformation, especially in his book, The Story of Utopias, published in 1922, which Benton read just as he was painting Self-Portrait with Rita. And in The Story of Utopias, Mumford writes, art in its social setting is neither a personal cathartic for the artist, nor a salve to quiet the itching vanity of the community. It is essentially a means by which people who have had a strange diversity of experiences have their activities emotionally fit into patterns and molds which they are able to share pretty completely with each other. Such arguments came to life in the earthy prose of An Artist in America, in which Benton claims, for all the possible limitations of my mind, I like that phrase, the possible limitations of my mind, and the distorting effects of my processes, for all the contradicting struggles and failures I have gone through, I have come to something that is in the image of America and the American people of my time. This conviction is in me pretty deeply. My American image is made up of what I have come across, of what was there in the time of my experience, no more and no less. By 1928, when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, John Dewey was the most famous philosopher in America. And Dewey was a pragmatist, and as such believed that the only authentic ideas were those that had practical value. And Benton once claimed that the only philosophy that attracted him was pragmatism. And this, by the way, he wrote an essay called Philosophy in which he outlined his adherence to pragmatic philosophy. But he never published it and never mentions anything about his interest in pragmatism in An Artist in America. So Benton once claimed that the only philosophy that attracted him was pragmatism. And like so many Depression-era artists, he was especially seduced by Dewey's 1934 book, Art as Experience. Benton had become familiar with Dewey and his ideas a full 15 years before, just as he was locating himself in Chilmark. And one Dewey essay that Benton knew before turning to his trademark realist style was titled Americanism and Localism, which appeared in 1920. In the essay, Dewey claims, quote, the only things that seem to be nationwide are the high cost of living, prohibition, and devotion to localisms. It's in this essay that Dewey makes the famous argument that the locality is the only universal. And particularly appealing to Benton was Dewey's trenchant observation that, quote, instead of signifying being shut up within one's own private feelings and sensations, experience signifies active and alert commerce with the world. At its height, it signifies complete interpenetration of self in the world of objects and events. What Dewey means here is that experience is transactional. It is not something that we experience alone. In fact, Dewey said that anything we experience on our own is not, in fact, an experience. Experience must be transactional to be experience. So we have to be fully immersed in experience, and when we are, self, object, event, and community merge into one. Now, Benton read Art as Experience, in which Dewey refines his pragmatic and regionalist philosophies, just as he began work on his memoir. To fashion the aesthetic philosophy he outlines in the book, Benton borrowed from Williams, Mumford, and Dewey. But as I said, it wouldn't do for him to link his ideas about experience and region to these names, or to any other name for that matter, because doing so would interfere with his seeming authenticity. But the point I am making, and I'm almost done with it, but the point I am making is that the authenticity Benton self-represents in his autobiography was a mirage, as in truth, his regionalist philosophy was deeply rooted in urban philosophical discourses about the merits of all kinds of experiences in all kinds of regions. What the pungent language of An Artist in America masks is the degree to which Benton derived the book's themes and tone from an elite and academic intellectualism. Why does this matter? Why point out that Benton's memoir is deceiving? Well, first of all, because it testifies to how rich and complex his apparently straightforward writing really is. And second of all, because drawing attention to Benton's false memories and self-image orients us to the primary difficulties facing all biographers. Benton has been written about in two ways. Critics and art historians tend to concentrate on his attacks against modernism and abstraction and emphasize his reactionary aesthetics. The Marxist art historian Meyer Shapiro said that Benton concocted an escape from the demands of the crisis, meaning the Depression, and provided a pitiful and inept alternative to realism guided by radical values. Another art historian, H.W. Jansen, saw in Benton's politics and paintings a latent fascism. Many of the paintings officially approved by the Nazis recall the works of the regionalists in our country, Jansen wrote. The regionalists, he added, revoked allegiance to humanity as a whole. In response to a 1989 exhibition of Benton's works here at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the now deceased art critic Robert Hughes stated that the vulgar artist had been, quote, tarted up until the eyes cry uncle. Now, Benton's previous biographers, in contrast, have apotheosized him. Authors such as Matthew Bagel, Polly Burroughs, and Henry Adams, and the filmmaker Ken Burns have focused on the amusing peculiarities of his personality, his drinking, profanity, and iconoclasm. In their hands, Benton emerges as a folk hero. Now, either way, Benton emerges as a man at odds with his era, as an outsider artist and a contrarian. Now, the book that I meant to write is simpler, and as it happens, also more complicated. Benton is my protagonist, not his politics or the politics of his friends and enemies, and not his cowboy antics, but the man and the life he led. That's the simple part. However, while one hates to summarize any life, especially one as rich as Benton's, it's fair to say that he was, despite an aesthetic consistency, a paradox. And that's the complicated part. On the one hand, he was an anachronism, an agrarian born into modernity. On the other, he was a man of his time. He was dogmatic, a communist turned New Deal liberal, treacherous but loyal, humorous, and melancholy. These paradoxes, however, don't reveal themselves as tidy dichotomies. Rather, they unfold as capriciously as his century did. Benton lived his moment. He tried everything the time had to offer, sometimes all at once, and so cannot be called a contrarian. If we can trust his advocacy for experience and active commerce with the world at all, then we ought to be able to judge him as one who lived his heady political moment. What's often lost in sketches of Benton is the genuine anxiety one feels when compelled to choose between two different kinds of absolutism. Democracy and communism would be those instances here. The compulsion of Benton and his peers and enemies was to always express themselves with finality and to construct foundational principles. This can be exaggerated and dangerous work, for it often obscures the ambivalences that determine character and belief. Having a chair thrown at him by an angry communist, as Benton did, or being called a fascist, as he was called, had as much to do with Benton's reaction to radical leftism as did his supposed, quote-unquote, horse sense, as he called it. In this case, what biography gives us then is less a new Benton than a man in full, one who lived in his moment rather than one who merely observed it from a distance. The political portrait is a portrait of one's exterior. The political portrait, because it ignores human inconsistency, is usually a caricature. And biography always works against caricature. It's a search for interiority, or what the great literary historian Leon Adele, writing about biography, calls, quote, habitual disorder, the abruptness, the variation, the unreliability of human expression. Now, if that's true, and I think that it is, then who better for biography than Thomas Hart Benton?